screen again, and Dr. Davis, you can give me the thumbs up that I'm showing your correct slides. Dr. Davis is the Vice Chair of Pediatrics and the Chief of the Division of Newborn Medicine at Tufts. He's also the Associate Director of Tufts CTSI and the Director of the Trial Innovation Liaison Team. And he's going to talk to us today about the International Neonatal Consortium, or INC. So happy to hear from you, Dr. Davis.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. Next slide, please. So looking at neonatal intensive care, just giving you a little bit of background, 6% of the approximately 3.7 million births each year end up in the NICU. We have the highest prematurity rates of any affluent country in the world, the highest rates of maternal mortality, and a variety of other complications that makes us quite special, with the total cost of prematurity over $29 billion a year, according to the March of Dimes. And there's really only been marginal improvements in survival and outcome in the last 20 years. And about 80% of the drugs used in the NICU are not FDA approved for use. Next slide, please. So why is that? Why have neonates been having so much difficulty? Well, there's limited interest from sponsors, small numbers of neonates affected by a particular disease. Obviously, it's a very high-risk population, difficulties with study designs, lack of definitive outcome measures, a need for additional safeguards. And then how long do you follow these patients up? And that's one of our great challenges for all of us. And as we look at data, there's lots of neonatal data out there, but it's not always tied beautifully to longer-term outcomes. So most of the national and international efforts are being driven by legislation and regulators. And the last FDA drug approved for preterm infants that really significantly improved survival and outcome was pulmonary surfactant in 1991. So we really haven't had another drug in the last 30 years that has made a dramatic improvement. And in 2012, when we passed the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, or FDASIA, it was the first time that we were able to require FDA to have neonatologists hired. I was asked to set up the first neonatal advisory committee because all the legislation out there, and we've heard a lot about BPCA, has really helped pediatrics a lot, but neonates are still considered therapeutic orphans, and we haven't made much progress. Next slide, please. So the FDA did go to the Critical Path Institute, and you heard a lot of it from Jeff, so I'm not going to go over it again. And they asked them to set up an international neonatal consortium. So in 2015, there were 4 or 5 of us sitting around a room trying to figure out how we're going to make this work. And we started to put together topics. So this was a slide from when INC was first developed, and the conditions on the right that we initially voted on that we were going to look at in more detail. And the nice thing about this is truly a public-private partnership, but we sit in the same room together with regulators and industry and academic investigators and parents and nurses and everyone, because this is a pre-competitive space and we don't review specific products, but we do everything for industry and investigators to improve the design and outcomes for their clinical trials. Next slide, please. And this is what INC looks like now. So we now involve 5 global regulatory agencies, and the FDA is very active in cluster calls with a variety of other regulatory partners around the world to discuss some of the issues that we've brought up. 9 major pharmaceutical companies, nursing organizations, parent advocacy groups, 55 academic institutions. It's approximately 40 countries, 30 to 40 countries now that we are active in. So we've made a tremendous amount of progress in a relatively short time frame. Next slide, please. And these are the projects we're working on now. We decide which projects are of high priority. We listen to our industry partners. We listen to the regulators asking us for help because they're not certain what to require from some of their clinical trials. So I'm not going to go through these data in totality, but you can see some of the projects we're working on now. Next slide, please. And these are some of the papers that we've worked on. So in seizures, definitions of chronic pulmonary insufficiency. Tamara Lewis asked earlier about BPD. There's now 18 definitions of BPD. And so we're trying to put that in perspective, and a variety of other things, looking at the best assessment tools to look at neurodevelopmental outcome and improving safety reporting in neonatal clinical trials. This is a few of probably 50 or 60 papers that we've published in the last 3 or 4 years. Next slide, please. And Jeff gave you a real good overview of the data operations at Critical Path. And we received a large grant from the FDA to use real-world data to generate real-world evidence in neonatology to help FDA generate drug approvals. So the idea is to assemble a data set of up to 1 million neonates, but purely globally. So not just in the United States, but around the entire world. And the design is to identify gaps that impede the optimal use of existing real-world data, to identify solutions to improve the usability of it, to establish global best practices, to establish safety and efficacy of unapproved products. So if we had a database and the FDA could look and say, well, we see 80,000 preterm infants who have received furosemide, for instance, that is not FDA approved for use in neonates, but is used routinely. It does look safe. It does look effective. We believe we can give you product approval without having to do any particular clinical trials. Now, that's not always the case, obviously, and I'm not saying for every drug, but we really are excited that the regulators are working with us on this. The other major project is looking at, and Jeff alluded to this, simulated control groups. So if we do have a database of 1 million babies and we have a company or an investigator that wants to look at a drug and is testing it out in 200 infants, and instead of 200 controls, could we use 25 controls to maintain the blind, and then use the data set to simulate in a much more diverse way with the race, ethnicity, geography, and be able to do this from multiple countries to be able to really facilitate product approvals. Next slide, please. And this is really what it looks like, and I'm not going to go into it in detail. You can see all the data sets that we're going through so far. We have over 350,000 patients in there. We're expecting another 150,000 patients to be coming in the next month or two, and hope to get us towards 1 million over the next year. And so we're going to be looking at a disease progression model of BPD to try to help the FDA. There are many companies and investigators that want to test products in that space, but with so many definitions and outcome measures, they're holding off, and they're asking us to help decide what the outcome measures should be for clinical trials. We're trying to establish something as simple, although it's not simple, as normal laboratory value reference ranges, and to reduce clinical trial costs and expedite drug and device development. Next slide, please. I just want to mention very quickly, we're supporting genomic studies from Inc. SMA and congenital eye diseases are the only ones in neonates now that are amenable. We've just finished off the Gemini trial, which is a comparison of rapid whole genomic sequencing to a targeted exome panel and acutely ill neonates, looking at diagnostic yield, clinical utility, economic impact. The only entry criteria was infants less than a year of age with a, quote, suspected genetic disorder. That's it. Could be any organ system or disease. We studied 400 infants. We completed the trial 18 months ahead of schedule, and we're able to use with urgent cases such as seizures or hemodynamic instability, we could move things through much faster. Next slide, please. And just very briefly, It's not often that you feel like in a trial that you are changing the world, but I think we were very surprised that 53% of all infants receive variant findings related to phenotype. Over 140 to 150 new variants were detected. A number of secondary findings, malignant hyperthermia, BRCA genes, etc. We made a number of diagnoses and families that didn't know they had these disorders by looking at the infants. And what was interesting is these targeted panels could not provide a finding in 22% of all the positive cases due to the genes not being included or structural variants not identified. And this really has significant implications for developing novel biologics and gene therapies. And we are now being approached by almost every major pharmaceutical company in the world saying that they have the vectors, they have the ability, they'd like to be able to develop some treatments for hundreds of different single gene or other disorders in neonates. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end here that there's an urgent need to accelerate drug, biologic, and device development for children. We also have supported the ShipMD network for devices, which is system of hospitals for innovation in pediatric medical devices. I will say that most of the efforts now with any of these drug development issues are being driven purely by legislation and regulation. Multi-stakeholder efforts are essential, such as broadly engaged team science, of which we are an exemplar, and engagement of global cooperative networks and data. And usually using new diagnostic technologies, real-world data and evidence, genomics, biologics to drive that precision medicine is going to continue to drive innovation in that space. So I think I'll stop there and we can take some more questions.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Davis. It's always great to hear about the good work at both CPATH and at INC. I'm going to watch the chat box for some additional questions that come in, but just one, and then I know we're going to move into some breakout groups for the next bit here. But it strikes me that much of the work that you're doing in defining outcomes would be helpful not only for the neonatal space, but for pediatrics in general, and then also for our colleagues on the maternal side to be able to collate these outcomes in infants, for example, moms who are exposed to different drugs. So do you have relationships with, that sort of cross that maternal side as well?
Yeah, I mean, we really do through FDA. So for instance, Lin Yao, who runs the maternal pediatric side of things, is very much engaged. And the regulators have been absolutely fantastic in working with us, funding us, and driving what we want to do. It's a big, heavy lift looking at the maternal space as well. We've talked about preterm birth, we've talked about opioids, and how we could interact with some of the maternal groups. Part of it, I think people think there's so much to do in the neonatal space that it's hard to figure out how to interact with some of these other groups without taking on too much at the same time. You saw all the different working groups we have. And the parents are really driving this, which is one of the few systems where we have parents on the executive committee helping us decide exactly what topics we should be looking at, most of them having had preterm babies in the NICUs. So I agree with you. I think we want to look at some of the technologies we're developing and see, and the outcome measures are particularly important in the pediatric space, because how far do you look at these kids? And industry doesn't want to wait 15 years for outcomes for obvious reasons. And FDA is not sure how long you go for safety either. So it's a real challenge.
Well, eventually we'll have a multi-generational cohorts, right? And we'll be able to answer
Yes.
all kinds of interesting questions about drugs no one uses anymore. But hopefully
and the goal is to really do this globally too. We're hoping to design clinical trials that people can run in multiple countries simultaneously. If we get all the regulators to buy in, and at the end of the trial, every country gives product approval at the same time.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. With that, I think I'll hand things back to Sarah Quinney and to get some wrap up on our day so far and instructions for our next session. Sarah, are you with us?
Yep, I am here.
There
Thank
you are.
you.
You were under my chat box. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all of our speakers this afternoon as we wrap up. I think we had some really great talks. I know I've learned a lot about the landscape of maternal and pediatric therapeutics and the number of players and the amount of work it takes to understand this area as well, and how much work still needs to be done. And so with that, we're going to break up into some breakout rooms now.